The Stork Club, Manhattan, February 1946. When Lucky Luciano walked into the VIP room, every mobster at the table stood up except one. Bumpy Johnson stayed seated, cigar burning slowly, eyes locked on the man who had unified the Italian Mafia. Luciano's bodyguards instinctively reached for their guns, but Luciano raised his hand. He knew something they didn't. The black man sitting across from him controlled the Harlem numbers racket, and Luciano needed that power more than muscle. What Bumpy would say in the next 60 seconds would either form an alliance that reshaped organized crime forever, or ignite a war that would drown New York in blood. World War II was over, and America was celebrating, but in the smoke-filled back rooms of New York City, a different kind of battle was forming. Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia, had just been released from Dannemora prison after 9 years. The government had cut him a deal, helped secure the docks during the war using his Underworld connections, and his sentence would be commuted. Luciano delivered, but there was a catch. He was being deported to Italy in less than 3 weeks, and Luciano had no intention of leaving without securing his empire. The 5 families were stable. Frank Costello was running the Luciano family in his absence. Vito Genovese was plotting from Italy. Albert Anastasia controlled the docks. Everything was in place except for one problem: Harlem. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery generating millions every week, was thriving there, and the Italians wanted a piece of it. They had tried once before, in 1935, when Dutch Schultz forced his way in. Schultz had made one fatal mistake, underestimating Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Schultz ended up dead in a New Jersey tavern, riddled with bullets. Now, 11 years later, Luciano wanted what Schultz couldn't take, but Luciano was smarter. He knew Harlem couldn't be conquered with violence. It required respect, patience, and negotiation. So Luciano sent word to Bumpy Johnson. "Let's meet." Bumpy didn't respond for a full week, and that silence told Luciano everything. This wouldn't be easy. The Stork Club on East 53rd Street was Manhattan's most exclusive nightclub. Frank Sinatra performed there. J. Edgar Hoover drank there. On February 18, 1946, Lucky Luciano reserved the entire VIP room. He arrived with 6 men: Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Meyer Lansky, and 3 bodyguards who had killed more men than they could remember. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone. 40 years old, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy 3-piece suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. He never wore ties. A gold watch chain hung from his vest. His shoes shined to a mirror finish. In his right hand, he carried a leather briefcase. The bodyguards moved toward him, hands drifting toward their weapons, but Luciano lifted a single finger. "Let him through." Bumpy walked past them without a glance, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He pulled out a chair at the head of the table, a seat reserved for the boss, and sat down. He placed the briefcase on the table and calmly took out a cigar. No one moved. Costello's jaw tightened. Anastasia's hand hovered near his waistband. But Luciano smiled. He understood exactly what Bumpy was doing. This wasn't disrespect. It was a test. Luciano took the seat directly across from him. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming." Bumpy lit his cigar, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly toward the ceiling. "Mr. Luciano, you wanted to talk. So talk." Luciano folded his hands on the table, his voice calm and measured, the voice of a man who had negotiated with presidents and killers alike. "I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks. The government is sending me back to Italy. Before I go, I need to make sure New York stays in order. No wars, no chaos. Just business." Bumpy nodded once, but said nothing. "Harlem is the last piece," Luciano continued. "The numbers racket is making millions. My people want in. But I know you've been running things since Schultz died. You have the trust of the community, the infrastructure, the police. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to take what's yours, Bumpy. I'm offering a partnership. You run Harlem. We provide protection, capital, and connections. In return, we take 40%. You stay independent under our umbrella. The room fell silent. Costello leaned in. Lansky's fingers tapped softly against the table. Anastasia cracked his knuckles. Bumpy took another slow drag from his cigar. And what happens if I say no? Luciano's smile stayed in place, but his eyes turned cold. Then we have a problem, he said. Because if you're not with us, you're against us. And nobody survives being against us. It wasn't said with anger or heat. It was said with the calm certainty of a man who had built his entire empire on that exact principle. Bumpy set his cigar down in the crystal ashtray, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a single photograph. He slid it across the table. Lucky Luciano picked it up. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly around the edges. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Oak, Brooklyn, one of Albert Anastasia's gambling operations. Standing in front of it, clearly visible, was Anastasia himself, shaking hands with a well-known police captain. That was taken 3 days ago, Bumpy said quietly. I've got 12 more just like it. Different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization. The room went dead silent. Frank Costello's hand drifted toward his jacket. Anastasia rose halfway out of his chair, but Luciano didn't move. He stared at the photograph, then slowly lifted his eyes to Bumpy. Are you threatening me? No, Bumpy replied. I'm showing you respect. I could have sent these to the district attorney. I could have sent them to the newspapers. I could have burned your whole operation down before you even knew I had them. But I didn't. He leaned forward. You came to Harlem asking for a partnership. A partnership means equals. What you offered me wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover with a smile. Luciano placed the photograph back on the table. For the first time since Bumpy entered the room, he looked genuinely impressed. So what do you want? Bumpy picked up his cigar, took a slow drag, and let the question hang in the air. You want what Dutch Schultz wanted. What every Italian crew that ever looked at Harlem wanted. Control, but you can't have it. Not because you're not smart. Not because you're not strong. Because Harlem isn't yours to control. He gestured toward the window, toward the glow of Uptown. Schultz failed because he thought black people were stupid. He thought muscle was enough. Harlem doesn't work like that. You need trust. You need respect. You need to be one of us, and you never will be. Costello started to speak, but Luciano silenced him with a look. Bumpy continued. Here's what I will do. You asked for 40%. You get 10. 10% of the profits, not as protection money, as a service fee. You provide banking support. We need clean money to pay winners when the heavy numbers hit. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. In return, you get 10% of the net. He leaned back, his voice dropping. And one more thing. You never ever send your people into Harlem to collect. You want your money. You send a courier to my office. It'll be counted, wrapped, and ready. Your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine. That's the deal. The silence that followed was absolute. Meyer Lansky broke it first, turning to Luciano. Charlie, that's actually a smart play. 10%, no risk, no exposure. Clean money. Anastasia wasn't convinced. And what stops him from cutting us out once the banking's set up? Bumpy answered before Luciano could. The same thing that stops you from taking Harlem by force. A stalemate. You cheat me. Those photographs go public, and your political protection disappears. I cheat you. You come after me with everything you've got. Either we both lose, or we both get rich. Your choice. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but genuinely. You know what, Bumpy? Schultz was an idiot. He should have talked to you first. He stood and extended his hand. 10%. Banking and legal support. No soldiers in Harlem. Monthly payments. Bumpy stood and shook his hand, firm and steady. We have a deal. Kostlow exhaled. Lansky smiled. Even Anastasia sat back down as the tension drained from the room. Luciano held Bumpy's hand a moment longer. I've done business with presidents, cops, union bosses, killers. You're the first man who ever came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts or stupidity. Bumpy smiled, rare and genuine. When you figure out which, let me know. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship to Italy and never returned to American soil. But the deal he made with Bumpy Johnson held for the next 22 years. The numbers racket flourished. The 10% was paid like clockwork. The Italians handled banking through legitimate fronts. When Bumpy was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, Frank Kostlow personally made sure his family was protected. When Bumpy walked free in 1963, the deal was still intact. That meeting at the Stork Club became legend, not because of violence, but because two men from different worlds found a way to do business without destroying each other. Luciano later told associates in Italy, Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster I ever met, and the most dangerous, because he didn't need me to respect him. He demanded it. Bumpy never spoke publicly about the meeting, but those close to him said he kept that photograph of Anastasia in his office for the rest of his life. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. Power isn't about who pulls the trigger first. It's about who's smart enough not to.